from the Fight City NYC. Check us out on the web at www.fightcitynyc.com. My name is Ben Chan. I'm your host. And to my right, I've got Francisco Guzman from BoxeoMundial.com. And to my left, I've got Aris Pina from Gotham Boxing and from CompuBox. Today we've got a special guest live from Friendly, West Virginia. We've got author, boxing writer Lee Groves, and he's going to come on and talk to us about his new book. Before we bring him on, let me tell you a little bit about him. Lee Groves is a boxing writer. He's won 2 Boxing Writers Association of America awards. He used to write for Ring Magazine and KO Magazine in the 90s. He's written a lot for MaxBoxing.com. One of my favorite columns was Closet Classics, and he has one of the largest private boxing collections of DVDs and videos that exists. He's an International Boxing Hall of Fame voter. Currently, he's doing stuff for BoxingScene.com and for CompuBox, but we're bringing him on today to talk about his book, Tales from the Vault, a celebration of 100 Boxing Closet Classics, which is a compilation of articles that he's written over time about fights that were great but overlooked. And Lee, are you there?
I am here.
How are you doing?
How are you doing, Lee?
I'm doing great. There's nothing I'd rather do than talk boxing all the time.
Great to hear.
Great. So thank you for coming on to the show. And I've actually been reading your book, and I just have to say thank you. It's been really great. Just like you say in the introduction, getting in that time machine and going back to those fights and looking back upon them.
It is. It really was. And that's the mission of the book, like you said. These are 100 fights that have stuck in my memory over my 36 years as a boxing fan. But for whatever reason, you know, they're overlooked despite having all of the elements that make boxing such a great sport. The stories, the back and forth action, the changes in momentum, just the storylines, and it was the mission of this book to bring these fights out and give them the full historical rendering that they deserve.
Now, we ended up with 100 fights in the book. How many did you start with?
Well, I didn't really think about doing the book until I got to between 80 and 85 fights. And one day I went back and I realized, hey, look, I'm getting close to the 100 fight mark here. You know, this might make for a pretty interesting book. So I went back into the archives, wrote down the fights that I had already covered, thought of 10 categories to put these fights under. And once I categorized them, then I went about the task in filling in the holes to make the even 100.
Hey Lee, how far back do you go in fights? You know, from the first fight to your 100th fight, let's say.
Well, most of the fights are between 1975 and 2005, but there was one fight, I think it was in the shootouts chapter, with Ezra Charles and Bob Satterfield that took place in 1954. But the bulk of the fights are between 75 and 05, since most of these fights, virtually all of these fights, all of them, were from the video collection.
What would you say, compared to now, to fights that we see today, how would you compare the fights we have today versus those fights in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even the 50s, let's say?
Wow. You know, a lot of elements are inside the ring. A lot of the same elements are there. You know, you have 2 guys applying their skills the best that they can. I think one of the main differences between now and then is that, you know, referees back then let fights go a little longer than they do today. And you know, on the one hand, it's a good thing because ring safety is ultimate. It's the utmost. But at the same time, there are fighters with reputations that like Matthew Saad Muhammad, Arturo Gatti, you know, they get into trouble, but they find their way out. And as a result of the quicker stoppages today, you don't see as many titanic comebacks, let's say, of the Corrales-Castillo variety.
Understand. Okay, quick question for you, Lee. Now, in terms of, I've known you for a while. You've always pushed for the little guys for the International Boxing Hall of Fame to get inducted. And was that at first the basis of your book? to try to get the little guys out there in terms of their major fights that were overlooked because they were so small, flyweight, junior flyweight, and to try to get their name out there and their story in this book. Was that one of your main goals also?
That was a goal. That was a goal when I started the series. In fact, the first fight that I ever did for the series is also the first fight profiled in this book, Antonio Avilar and Wilfredo Vasquez. I think that took place at 118 pounds. And that was the fight that had the single greatest round I had ever seen, and that was the fifth round. You have to see it to believe it. I believe one fighter was dropped in the opening seconds, and then the other fighter comes back, and then the round ends with both of them trading wildly on the ropes. And by the end of the round, the crowd was on its feet and yelling themselves hoarse and waving their arms in the air. I mean, it was that kind of round. And it was that kind of round and that kind of fight that that prompted me to begin the Closet Classic series in the first place.
Interesting.
Now, Lee, when you got all these fights together, how did you go about organizing and choosing which categories the fights would go into? Because your book is divided into a number of different sections, you know, with the brawls, the shootouts. You also have a chapter devoted to big men. Yep. How did you go about deciding how to organize it that way?
Well, as I was writing down the fights from my archive, I thought, well, that fight was a shootout. Wow, that was a brawl. That was a war of attrition. That was a grudge fight. That was a sudden and violent ending. One of the big strengths of this book, I feel, is the variety. And, you know, most boxing books cover either one person or one topic or one strata of the sport. I wanted to have a book that covered the entire experience of boxing, of why it's such a great sport. And of course, boxing can take on a variety of forms. And I thought that that was the best. I thought of just the 10 type of fights that there are. You know, one of the unusual chapters in the book is undercard classics, because every so often you go to a fight card and you see an undercard fight that is better than the main event or even the co-main event. It ends up stealing the show, and that ends up being the fight that everybody talks about when they walk out of the arena. So I wanted to honor those guys, too. I wanted to honor the big guys, the little guys, everybody in the sport. And that's... And as I went through the book and went through the various fights, I found that there were 10 type of fights that fit the sport, and I organized them accordingly.
Hey Lee, what got you to love the sport? What, you know, who are your idols, let's say, in boxing, like?
Well, you know, I often talk with people about how I became a boxing fan, and for me it was a thunderbolt moment. It was a single fight in a single Saturday afternoon at a single time. It was Roberto Duran versus Esteban de Jesus, #2.
Yep. Wow.
That was a grudge fight. That was a war of attrition. You know, you could slot it into various categories, but what it was I got up and just by chance I turned the channel selector to ABC. And the fact that I used a channel selector instead of a remote, I tell you how long ago this was. But I was 9 years old, and I came across the fight, and there was Howard Cosell, you know, explaining the situation. Duran is the dominant lightweight champion, and he's fighting the only guy that ever beat him. And he has him in his hometown in Panama City, and it's 100 degrees outside. And the fight action was just as hot over the first 5 rounds as any I had subsequently seen.